Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Luke, for that introduction. So I'm going to say a little bit more about myself, and then we'll get rolling here with my session on dialogues about race and racism. So I am the son of immigrants. I was born in Ghana. I was about 2.5 years old when my family immigrated to the United States. And like many immigrants, part of the rationale for my parents bringing my siblings and I to the United States was for better educational opportunities. I think that's a classic sort of immigrant story. As a result of that, the schools in which my siblings and I went K through 12 happened to be, a little sarcasm there, in predominantly white spaces, in the sense that those are the schools in which my parents believed would set my siblings and I up for success later on in life. And so in K through 12, it was not until my junior year of college that I had for the first time a teacher or educator who was not white. And so for me, often having to grow up in predominantly white spaces, a lot of the dialogues around race that I was engaging with were often with people who did not look like me, who did not share my background, experiences, et cetera, or my stories. And so for me, like, it was having to engage mostly white folks around conversations and dialogues about race and racism, and trying to help them understand the ways in which their whiteness was manifesting in those spaces. And so I share that in part because I think that's what frames sort of my approach for today is. I think it's important for folks of color to engage across racial differences amongst ourselves as well. And I also think it's really important, but I think even more important, for white folks to engage other white people in dialogues about issues of whiteness, privilege, power, oppression. And then, of course, I think the goal then is then how can we do this across racial groups? So how can folks of color also engage with white folks across race and racism and talk about those issues in meaningful and productive ways? And so that's where I really started my career, was around trying to understand more about how we go about facilitating dialogues about race and racism in productive ways, as well as engaging in those dialogues as well. My work has more recently shifted to looking at student activism as well as racial battle fatigue, but this is where I started. The bulk of my early career was around engaging in as well as facilitating dialogue, specifically about race and racism, and which stemmed from my dissertation work, which really looked at how faculty across various disciplines engaged students in their classes on the topics of race and racism. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that to frame sort of what brings me into this space and what we're hoping to talk about here today. So just to start, I want you to just turn to the person next to you. So this is like 10 seconds. I just want you to introduce yourself. You likely have already done this through Penny's earlier session around when you had to break up and talk to somebody next to you. Just what's your name, what's your pronouns, what area and institution do you work in, and then what brings you here today. So again, just take about 10 to 20 seconds and just to start off by doing that with the person next to you. Okay, so let's come back together now. So the second thing that I want you to do is in your packet, there's a handout from my session, and I think on the front page there's a little space in which to do this. So I want you to think about how many of you in the room are faculty or teach courses? And then how many of you in some capacity work with students, whether it might be in a TRIO program, student affairs, higher ed, et cetera? Okay. What was that? How about if we've done both? Done both, and raise both hands. Okay. So I want you to just think of a space in your institution. So this can be your classroom space that you teach in. It can be a meeting space with your colleagues. It can be an advising space where you're working with a group of students. I just want you to think of a space on your campus where you work. And so just imagine what that space looks like. And then I want you to actually draw out what the space looks like. So if it's a classroom space, for example, how are the desks or chairs organized in the space? Where's the table? Where are the students often seated in the space? Where are you located as the person with more power in the space? What does it look like? Who are the people in the space? What race do they represent? What are their racial identities, their gender, sexual orientation, any other sort of demographic information that you know about the people in the space. So again, just draw out what that looks like. So again, this can be a classroom space, a meeting space, a space with students, and just sort of like visualize what that space looks like, and then just take some time to draw it out, or just think about it in your head about what that might look like. So just imagine again what that space might look like. So same person that you introduced yourself to just a few minutes ago, I now want you to talk about your different drawings, and then more specifically, what did you notice in your partner's picture as compared to yours? What was similar, what was different, what stood out to you, etc. So when I said draw, I immediately noticed some folks in the room cringed. So this is not about the look of the drawing, but I just want some folks to shout out, what are some of the things that you notice in your drawings? Like, what was similar, what was different? What are some of the things that you saw when you looked at your partner's drawing? Effort and no effort. It's not about the drawing itself. Okay, so your space was more inclusive to provide engagement. So when you say more inclusive, like, what are some of the things that made it more inclusive? Like, what are some examples of that? Okay, so in one of the examples here, what made the space more inclusive was, rather than having the chairs in rows, they were in a circle, and so everyone is included in that circle. So everyone is a part of that, was one of the features that this person noticed. What else stood out to you in the two drawings? So some of the things that I heard here were the way in which the space is designed. So for example, in the previous example we shared, it was around a circle, which is also typically how my classroom space is organized as well, and I sit as part of the circle. But in certain scenarios or situations, that actually may not be conducive depending on the situation. So again, I think it goes back to some of the things we've been talking about today, and particularly in Penny's session, around the biases or assumptions that we make. And so to not assume that merely the presence of a circle means that it's inclusive, but what might be the underpinning reasons that one designs a space in a certain way. So to be thinking about that. In my head right now too is this movement that's, I think, across the United States around getting rid of straws in restaurants, right? And the pushback that several folks with disabilities have done around how that seemingly a sustainable strategy is actually not as inclusive for all people. And so I think that's important for us to think about when it comes to space design as well. Let's take one more. What is something else that stood out in the two drawings? So why do you think you didn't have people in yours? Yeah, so why didn't you put people? Or why do you think you didn't put people? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the case, but you put the people, right? So in your mind, like, the people was important. Like, what were some of the rationales for that? Yeah. So I think that's an important observation in the space that you chose, was around like where you are most often engaged with folks, with your colleagues, right? So I thought that was an important piece too. So I want us to keep this image in mind as we go throughout the rest of our time here today, because I think, again, how we set up a space communicates a lot about what we value, what our intentions are, what our purpose is, even if it's not stated. So sometimes we walk into a space and we can't move it. We can't, because the chairs are stuck to the ground, and so that's the space that we're left with. But if we have agency to make the space different, what are the reasons that we're doing that? So to be thinking about what we might be conveying by making some of those choices. So I want you to just reflect on this briefly for a moment. So in a span of a course of a week, think to yourself, how often do you engage with students or your colleagues about race and racism? So just think of what a typical week looks like in your life on your campus, and then think of, again, race and racism. How often are you talking with colleagues and students about those two issues? So for some folks, I heard some folks sort of pause because my belief is that for some of us in the room, this is probably something we do quite often. For some of us, it may be a moment in time. It's not something that we often have to do. So again, think about why is that? So why is it that we might be engaging more often about race and racism in the span of a week as compared to somebody else, and what's underneath that? And we'll talk a little bit about some of those rationales and reasons in just a moment here. So then this brings me to the goals that I have for our time here today. So one is that I just really want us to review and learn about key terms related to engaging race and racism. So I want us to spend some time thinking about some definitions of some terms, because again, these are what's showing up in the space when we're talking about race and racism. I want us to understand intergroup dialogues as a way to engage around issues of race and racism, to also then apply that knowledge to specific scenarios that we'll talk about, and then lastly, to learn some specific tools for engaging in dialogues about race and racism, and thinking about how we might apply those tools differently depending on what our context looks like. My former institution was Miami University, where 87% or so of the undergraduate students on Miami's campus identify as white. And so more often than not on Miami's campus, most of the classes are going to be predominantly white. There might be, in a class of 25 or 30, one or two students of color in that classroom space. So that might look very different than it might look on your campus, for example, where maybe in a classroom of 20, 15 of the students identify as students of color. So again, that context really matters around how we might engage issues of race and racism. All right, so these are the terms that we're going to be talking about today around race and racism. One is dominant and subordinated identities, power, multidimensionality, and intersectionality. I'm only going to touch briefly on racial battle fatigue because, again, William Smith's session is exclusively on this topic. Vicarious trauma, emotional labor, and then white fragility. And to me, when we're talking about issues of race and racism, it's really, really important that we understand all of these terms because they're showing up even if we're not actually aware of how they're showing up. So I want us to spend some time thinking about what these terms might mean and look like. So let's start with dominant and subordinated identities. So a dominant identity is one in which one experiences privilege. On the flip side, a subordinated or minoritized identity. Somebody in the room asked earlier that term minoritized, around why we're using minoritized as opposed to minority. And again, it has to do with issues of power, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So dominant identities in the room. So again, these are identities in which one experiences privilege or power. So when it comes to race, what is the dominant identity in the United States around race? White. And why is that? Like, what makes white the dominant racial identity in the US? I heard power and money. Say that again? Colonialism, yes. What else makes whiteness the dominant racial identity? Media and imagery, I heard default. Yes, that is just assumed to be the norm, the default. Other groups are often labeled as non-white. I will never use the term non-white because, again, it positions whiteness as the standard to which all other groups are measured. So I prefer people of color for that reason. So then subordinate identities, again, these are identities in which one experiences oppression. So then on the flip side, what are subordinated racial groups in United States society? Black, yep. Native American, yep. Asian American, Pacific Islanders. Let's talk about other sort of identities too. So when it comes to gender, what's a dominant gender identity in our society? Sup, cisgender, man or woman. So what does the cis mean? So why is the cisgender part really important when we're talking about gender?
Someone who identifies with the gender that they were born with. Like, are you asking for the definition of cisgender?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. What is someone who identifies as the sex/gender identity that they were assigned to at birth?
Correct. And so for many of us in this society, so it's common that when a child is born, they announce it's a boy or a girl, male or female. So that's the sex at which you're assigned at birth. So for some of us in the room, the way in which we express our gender matches the sex that we were assigned at birth. So that's the case for me, for example. So I identify as a cisgender man because the sex male that I was assigned at birth is how I express my gender identity as a man. So that it matches, it links. It's the default. It's normal. And again, things that are default and normal are attached to privilege and power. And so for some of us in the room, that sex we were assigned at birth doesn't match the ways in which we identify our gender. So these are non-binary people or gender non-conforming people. And so we see, again, those folks as outside of the norm, which is what makes that a minoritized or subordinated gender identity. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we think about, let's talk about religion. What's a dominant religious identity in our society? Christian. I think I heard some say Protestant. What about sexual orientation? Heterosexual, straight, yep. And then what are some other minoritized identities when we think outside of race? So gender, again, class, sexual orientation, just shout those out in the room. English speaking. Ability, yep. Wait, did I say, I said minoritized identities, right? Yes. And so I would say in our society, non-English speaking, yes, would be the minoritized identity. Disability, yep. Obesity. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about why these terms matter in just a moment. So let's talk about multidimensionality. So all of us have various dominant as well as subordinated identities. Some of us have more dominant identities in the room. Some of us have fewer dominant identities. So in my particular case, I identify as Black. That's one of the most salient identities that I hold. It's my racial identity. As we talked about earlier, that's a minoritized or oppressed identity in our society. But I don't only identify as Black. Even if that's the identity that I often see the world through and it's the identity that I most often go to immediately, it doesn't take away from the fact that I also hold other dominant identities. As a cisgender man, someone who identifies as heterosexual, as a native English speaker, I also have a certain level of educational privilege with a PhD. My title as a faculty member gives me a certain level of class privilege. So I also have a lot of dominant identities that also intersect with my subordinated racial identity. And so that means that I move through the world as a Black, cis, heterosexual, educated person, and that grants me certain privileges and power as compared to, for example, Black women, because again, they have a subordinated gender identity. So there's a reason why my voice in a space is accorded more weight often than women, because in our society, we often pay more attention to when men say something as compared to women. So again, all of these identities intersect to make me who I am. So multidimensionality talks about how the individual identities intersect to make us who we are. And then intersectionality talks about how these larger systems of oppression are playing a role in our society. So how racism and sexism unite to, again, oppress women of color, for example. So I think those two pieces are also important again. So again, the reminder in the room is that we all hold both dominant as well as subordinate identities. Because our dominant identities are privileged identities, it means we often don't spend as much time thinking about them because they're just assumed. We don't have to think about those identities. because, again, it just assumed that spaces are designed for white cisgender men, for example. So folks who identify as white cis men often move through the world without having to think about that privilege and power. So then that brings us to power. So all of these pieces, again, are tied to power. Folks who have power get to decide how spaces are designed, get to decide how people are rewarded for the work that they do, get to decide how our society is structured, how it's put together. Two forms of power. Informal power is based on these identities that we've been talking about. And then formal power is often based on our role or our title. So in a classroom space, I hold formal power as a professor. That means I hold more power in the space as compared to students in the space. It also means informally, though, because I'm a cis man, I hold some more informal power in that sense. So we often grant folks formal power, and sometimes we often grant folks informal power as well. So both of those can be granted to people. But the formal power, again, is often based on our title or position, whereas the informal is based on these intersected identities. So before I move forward, any questions about any of these terms thus far? And again, I think it's really important to understand these terms because they play a role in how we're able to engage in dialogues about race. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. We're doing well? Okay, let's keep going. So racial battle fatigue, like I said, William Smith is going to talk a lot more about this, but I just wanted to point it out here briefly. This is the exhaustion as well as negative consequences that folks of color experience from daily exposure to race and racism. So I mentioned earlier my former institution, Miami University. So it was common that I would walk across campus on a given day and not see any other people of color on that campus. And so often by the time that I was done with my day on campus, I was physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted just from having to always be on alert around my blackness. It felt like I was always being monitored or watched by white folks in that space because there were so few of us on that campus. So I was experiencing racial battle fatigue as a result of that. So I think that's really important to talk about as well. Vicarious trauma is a related concept in the sense that folks who are exposed secondhand to trauma can also experience some of these health consequences. So often, as people of color, we want to prepare our kin, our friends, our family, our children for how they might experience racism as a result of their skin color. What we might inadvertently do as a result of sharing those stories is we might actually inadvertently pass on trauma to future generations. There's research that shows that Holocaust survivors actually can pass on the trauma of experiencing the Holocaust to future generations. And so again, that trauma can be passed down on and on. And so as people of color, again, we're trying to prepare our friends, family, or children for what racism might look like. And then as a result of that, we might be exposing them to secondhand trauma. And this is not to, again, blame folks of color, blame us for doing that, but it's just to point out how vicarious trauma can also exist in relationship to racial battle fatigue when we're talking about race and racism. And then emotional labor is often, this stems from studies around gender in the workplace, around how women are often having to protect the feelings of men in workplaces because men are unable to really handle, I think, the realness that comes with sexism. And so women often spend a lot of emotional energy and labor trying to exist in workplaces and move in workplaces because, again, of the ways in which patriarchy manifests in our society. So this is an extra form of labor that women perform in the workplace that men are not having to perform because workplaces, again, are designed for cis men because that's the dominant identity that exists in our society. Similarly, people of color also can experience emotional labor when it comes to engaging with white folks around issues of race and racism, and having to share stories of pain, violence, and trauma, and still not being believed by white folks that this is as problematic as we say that it is. And so that's, again, an additional labor that folks of color are having to perform when it comes to engaging in issues of race and racism. All because of this notion of white fragility. So Robin DiAngelo, if you haven't read her work, I would strongly encourage you to read it around this notion of white fragility, which is essentially because of the ways in which white folks are socialized in our society to not really talk about race and racism very often. When they are in situations where they have to talk about race and racism, they are often unable to handle the amount of emotions that comes from having to talk about that. There's a reason why often in spaces where racism comes up and white supremacy, white people shut down, they become defensive, they become resistant. Luke and Ebony talked about the defiant and resistors earlier today. There's a reason why white folks often exhibit those emotions when it comes to talking about race and racism. And again, it's because they're uncomfortable engaging honestly about those issues because they really haven't been socialized to talk openly and explicitly about race and racism. So what happens then with white fragility is that in cross-racial dialogues, people of color spend an inordinate amount of time trying to manage and protect white people's feelings because we know that if we talk honestly about how race and racism is happening, they're likely going to blame us, they're going to minimize our experiences, become defensive, cry in the space, and then the attention then shifts to the white folks who are crying as opposed to us actually talking about race and racism, right? So folks in the room are laughing because you've likely observed this happening, right? So we're talking about race and racism, a person of color shares a story, a white woman starts crying because it's too hard to hear that story. And then what happens in the space? The facilitator and all of the white folks then turn to the white person, and that occupies the space, right? And so now we're not actually talking about race and racism anymore. We're protecting and comforting the white person in that space when the space was intended to actually be for folks of color to talk openly about race and racism. So that, again, is all because of white fragility and because of dominance around whiteness. So again, these pieces are really important. So this then begs the question, so I spent about 20 minutes or so talking about all of these terms. So why does knowing these terms matter when it comes to engaging about race and racism? What are some of your thoughts about why is it important to know all of those like 8 or so terms that I just spent some time defining and talking about? Yes. So essentially, we're going to be navigating all of these terms in these dialogues, so it's important that we know what they are so that we can identify them when they're happening. So to me, I think that to me hits the nail on the head of why it's really important. So in a space, when we're talking about racism, again, remember we all have dominant and subordinate identities. So yes, the topic is about race and racism, but that doesn't mean that we escape the other identities that are in the space. There's a reason why in conversations or dialogues about race and racism that the topic somehow always shifts to other areas or identities in that space. And that's, again, because as a society, we're often uncomfortable talking about race and racism, so we find other ways to make it relatable or bring in other topics. So if we're not cognizant of our dominant and subordinate identities, we're not aware of how those identities show up in the space, right? And how a room full of folks who identify as white might engage these conversations very differently than a space that there's more folks of color in the room. Power as well, right, is really important in these dialogues. So if we're unaware of how power shows up, like power between the participants in the group, we might not understand why in this dialogue space, why the 3 or so folks of color are silent in the space as compared to the white folks in the space. On the flip side, we might not also understand why in a space of 25, when there are only two folks of color, why are the two folks of color the ones who are constantly speaking in that space? So if we don't understand how power is manifesting, we're not able to, again, address this when it's happening. And then the last example I'll share is, to me, around this notion of white fragility, because the story that I shared seemed to gain the most sort of like reaction from folks in the room. Again, so in conversations about race and racism, when we see white folks engaging in behaviors where they're minimizing, deflecting, shutting down, becoming defensive, all of those behaviors, we expect that those behaviors are going to happen, and we might then be able to take steps to intervene when it's happening and not shift the attention to protecting white folks' feelings in the space, but actually knowing how to re-engage them or reopen the space so that we can acknowledge that emotion is happening, but not allow it to overtake the space. But if we don't know what white fragility is, we might be surprised or unprepared when that shows up in the dialogue space. So to me, these are some of the reasons why these terms are really important for us to understand. So having said all of that, let's then talk about some strategies for actually doing this. And one of the pieces that I think is really important is this piece by Jimena Zuniga, Bridging Differences Through Dialogue. It's an older piece, but it's a piece that I still come back to because to me, it really helps explain the 4-stage intergroup dialogue model that to me is a really important model for us to use when engaging in dialogues about race and racism. So these are the 4 stages. I'll list them here, then I'll talk briefly about what they look like and then share some examples. So stage 1 is creating an environment for dialogue. Stage 2 is situating the dialogue. Stage 3 is exploring conflicts in multiple perspectives. And then 4 is moving from dialogue to action. So one of the classes that I teach, that I've taught at Miami University, I'm in a graduate program, so I work primarily with master's students who are interested in the career in student affairs. And so I teach a class called Dialogue about Privilege, Power, and Oppression. And the goal of the course is to really help students understand how to engage in dialogues about privilege, power, and oppression. And so in this particular case, stage 1 is creating an environment for dialogue. So to me, this is the most important stage in the process. If we don't actually set up the conditions for dialogue to happen, none of the other stages are possible. So for me, in a span of 15 weeks, so I'll use my class as an example, we meet once a week for 3 hours over the course of 15 weeks. I might spend the first 2 or 3 class sessions just on trying to build trust in the space before I even assign any required readings. And, as a faculty member, as a professor, I often sort of think to myself, I'm always drawn to readings and content. And so I take, about a fifth of the semester with no readings. Am I okay with that choice? Sometimes it's hard for me to justify that as a professor because I think, well, students have to have information, they need content. How can I spend 2 or 3 class sessions without any sort of content, readings? And I always go back to making that choice because I've seen that when I don't do that, students are not ready to engage the dialogues throughout the rest of the semester because, again, that trust building is really, really critical. And so we'll spend the first 3 weeks, and these are some examples of things that folks can do in this first stage, is setting up ground rules. So how are we going to engage the space? What are we going to do if somebody breaks these ground rules? How are we going to talk about it? Whose responsibility is it to bring it up if that happens? Some lower risk activities. Something that I do in week 2 of the semester is I have this activity called Stories in the Box exercise. And I ask students in my class to bring 5 items to class. So of those 5 items, 1 has to represent a dominant identity that they hold, and then another one has to represent a subordinated identity that they hold. And then they talk about those items and how it represents their identity. And then the other 3 can be any combination of identities that they hold. So it can be I'm an athlete, and this is a trophy I brought because that's really important to me. But again, one has to represent a dom identity, one has to represent a sub identity. And I do this as well. One of my philosophies as an educator is I never ask students to do something that I myself don't model or also don't engage in the classroom space. So I bring in 5 items as well. Often the identity that I bring in that represents my subordinated identities, I often bring in my driver's license. And I tell students in the class the story of that. Anytime I'm driving, doesn't matter where it is, my license, registration, and insurance are always on the dash of my vehicle. They're always visible. And so for me, that's because of the fear that I have as a black person being pulled over by a police officer. Whether it's stories from Trayvon Martin and countless black teenagers who have been killed by police officers. So I get very afraid, particularly when I'm driving from Cincinnati to Oxford, Ohio, which is on the southwestern part of the state of Ohio that goes through a lot of one-lane roads. So to me, there's a lot of fear that I have about that. So I don't ever want to be in a case where I'm pulled over and I'm having to reach into my glove compartment and an officer thinks I'm reaching for a weapon and not my license and registration. So again, I think constantly about my blackness, about my black race. So I share that with students so that they understand how I move through the world as a black person and how that is an oppressed identity that I hold. Often for my dominant identity, I bring in a picture of Sebastian. So Sebastian is my 8-year-old. He would say he's 8 and a half. The half is really important right now. So I bring in a picture of Sebastian, and so I tell the story of how, as a faculty member, faculty, I often have a lot of privilege in setting my schedule. So I can often go to the grocery store on a Wednesday morning, or I often will take Sebastian to the playground on like a random Tuesday morning. And often when I do this, it's often me and a lot of other moms who are there with their kids. And often the moms will, this happens every single time I take Sebastian to the playground. They often make comments around like, oh my gosh, like it's so great that you're here with your son at the playground, or that you're actually like out spending time here with your child. And so to me, like, it's a dominant identity around like cis male privilege and patriarchy that it's often assumed that taking care of children is women's work. And so men are often praised for spending time with our kids, when in reality, like, what the hell should we be doing? Like, this is, like, Sebastian's my child. Like, why would I not be spending time with him in that way? Like, it shouldn't be seen as exceptional or as, like, a big deal for me to do that. But again, it's because of the privilege that comes with being a cis man and it being seen as, like, not my job to really be tending to my kids in that way. So that, again, it's just assumed that women are supposed to do that. It's assumed to be, again, women's work. And so, to me, I share these identities and these pieces because, again, that's something that might be useful to you to use as a way to, again, build trust in the room. And so what it does is it enables each person in the room to, again, it's a pretty low risk activity. Folks choose what to share, what not to share, but it at least gets them in the practice of talking explicitly about their dominant identity as well as their subordinate identity in this space, and then we can see what the identities in this space might look like. So then stage 2 is situating the dialogue. So this is where we really learn about differences and commonalities of experiences, and we develop a shared vocabulary of the terms that we're going to be using. If you've noticed, actually, the way in which I structured this talk is exactly modeling the 4 stages of dialogue. So we started off with a low-risk activity around introduce yourself to somebody in the space, draw your classroom space. We then moved to talking about terms so that we can all be on a similar page around these are some of the terms that we're using in this space. And then we're going to get to some application pieces, moving from dialogue to action. So some examples here might be to ask participants to define the terms that we're using. I think often around social justice, we just assume that folks in the room understand all of these terms that we're using, but in reality, like some of these might be buzzwords, like Penny talked about implicit bias. Like that's a term that we use often, but what does that actually mean? What does it mean when I say like minoritized? Why am I saying that? Why am I not saying Latina, Latino? Why am I saying Latinx? So again, these terms around like what they mean, I think is really important. We might also use some caucus groups in this space. So caucus groups are when you break groups up according to identities. So often in my classes, I'll have caucus groups of where white folks just go in dialogue with other white folks in the room, because often it's important for white folks to talk about issues that they're facing with only other white people so that it doesn't manifest or show up in the space when folks of color are present. Similarly, I think it's important for folks of color to have time to engage with other folks of color in this space, because I think often we're forced to engage with primarily white folks, especially if we're at predominantly white environments like my former institution. So again, these are some things that we might do in stage 2. Stage 3 then is when we start to explore conflicts in multiple perspectives. So because we spent time building trust, folks have engaged in some lower risk activities, they might then be ready to engage the hot issues in the room. So on a day, if we're talking about immigration, we might say, why is there so much rhetoric around like building a wall and about undocumented people? Like, what is that about? And so we might spend that time talking about that to see what the different perspectives are in the room. And then again, folks have built the trust, so hopefully then they're able to share more freely about what's happening and also be pushed if some of their assumptions and biases come out in the space. And then finally, moving from dialogue to action, to identify concrete steps moving forward from the dialogue. This is one that I nuance a bit. I sometimes think we think talking about race is not actually action, when in reality, I think it's like that is action. Like I think the mere fact of folks talking about race in meaningful ways is a way in which to move forward. And so again, it's not to sort of put this demarcation between dialogue and action, but to not judge some of the action steps that one might do. So in one of my classes that I taught, one of the white students said at the end of the semester, what they were really gonna work on doing was to, whenever their white friends made racist jokes, they were going to interrupt that and they were going to challenge it. And so some folks in the room might think that, well, that's fairly trivial, but in reality, that was actually a really significant thing for that student. And so the goal here is not to minimize the significance of the action steps that folks are taking, but for folks to actually do something that they can do in their own circles of influence and in their spheres. Another activity that I use in my class is dialogue reflection partners. So I pair students up based on their identities. So they're paired up with somebody who in some way holds a different identity than they do. And then 3 times throughout the semester, they write a reflection just about, these are thoughts I'm having about the class, about what's going on. They then read each other's reflection. They come together and they engage in dialogue for at least an hour about the reflection. And then they go back and they write a post-reflection about some new insights or questions that they gain from the dialogue with their partner. What I like about this activity is they get a chance to engage with somebody on a more deep level at least 3 times throughout the semester, and it helps them also apply some of the concepts that they're talking about in class with somebody else who they've been working with throughout the semester. So that's the 4-stage intergroup dialogue model. What I want to do now is, with the remaining time that we have, we're going to talk through some ways in which to apply some of this learning. So I'm going to read through 5 scenarios that I came up with, and then I want you to sort of choose a scenario with a smaller group of folks and talk about how you might use the 4-stage intergroup dialogue process or the 4-stage model to intervene or to engage in this particular scenario. And these are all things that have happened either to me or that I've seen with my colleagues or trainings that I've done at other places. So the first scenario is you're meeting with one of your advisees of color. She says she is taking a psychology-related research class. The class is learning how to develop strong research questions. She keeps developing research questions that draw from her own experiences with race and racism. And the professor continually tells her the questions are too personal and can't come from her life experiences, but need to come from the literature. You sense the student's frustration at feeling like her life experiences don't matter. How do you respond to the student? How do you engage your colleague in a conversation? Scenario 2, it's the start of the fall semester, and you have your first meeting with one of your students. You want to be more attentive to race-related issues this academic year in your work with advisees. How might you structure this initial meeting to be more attentive to race-related issues? Number 3, it's your first research meeting of the semester. You have 5 students, 3 white women, 1 white man, 1 Latina woman working with you on your research team this semester. How might you structure this meeting to be welcoming of students? And then number 4 is you are in a staff meeting facilitating a discussion of how to recruit and retain more colleagues of color within your area. In the room of 10, only 2 identify as people of color. 15 minutes into the discussion, you notice that none of the white people have said anything. How do you intervene? What do you do? And then lastly, you are in a staff meeting with the president of your institution. You're discussing how to increase the retention of students of color. One of your white colleagues angrily says, "We just need to tighten our standards and stop admitting unprepared students of color." You feel triggered by this comment. What do you do? Okay. So again, I want you to take the next about 10 minutes or so to group up with a group of folks and choose one of the scenarios. I'll replay them here so you can actually see them again. So those are the scenarios. The alternative is maybe none of these scenarios means anything to you and you want to discuss something that's actually happening on your campus. So if that's the case, feel free to do that as well. But again, the goal is to choose a particular scenario and then to think about how the 4-stage intergroup dialogue model might help you intervene or engage around issues of race and racism within that particular scenario or something that's happening on your campus. All right, so I just want to close with just sharing some tools or strategies that you might use in your work around addressing racism. So let me just say 2 things before I get to that. So I just had an aha moment. So I shared that story earlier about the playground, and I've shared this story so many times, and this is the first time I'm thinking to myself, like I wonder if part of it is because there's an assumption that Black men are not caretakers. So I'm gonna go journal and reflect on that during lunch. But I just wanted to at least share that I've been it just occurred to me I've been processing this over that time that I had never made that thought or connection, that I've always connected it to a dominant identity, which I think can still be the case. And part of my philosophy is both and. 2 things can exist in the same space. So it could also be that and, again, the assumption or bias around seeing a Black man with a child and how that's not something that white women often expect to see. So I just wanted to point that out. And then the second sort of what's that? Okay. So then see, this is why you're closing us out. And then the second thing is, so what I've shared around the 4-stage process, I just also want to acknowledge that I have the benefit of having the same group of students over the course of 15 weeks of a semester. Sometimes you're in a room and you have an hour, or sometimes you're in a meeting and somebody says something that's racist, and you don't have the luxury of going through the 4-stage process in those 10 seconds, right? So sometimes you have to decide what to do if you haven't really built a trust with that person. Do I intervene? Do I have the emotional energy or capacity to do this in this space? And if you don't have the emotional energy and capacity and it's tied to a subordinate identity, to not beat yourself up over for not doing that, because sometimes it's okay to take care of yourself. If you do, however, have a more dominant identity, that's when, again, allies, to bring it back to allies, part of your job is to step in so that folks of color don't have to be the ones who are always bringing up issues of racism. So if you call yourself an ally as a white person, that's your responsibility, is to step in and interrupt that with other white folks so that folks of color can rest, recuperate, and not have to be the ones who are always bringing up race and racism. So let's then close with some strategies. So validate. This one is seemingly simple, but yet it's so infrequently used in my own experiences. So when a person of color says something racist happened or somebody did something racist, so often a white person in the space will say, well, I've known John for 18 years and they don't have a racist bone in their body. Or maybe they were having a bad day, or they didn't mean it that way. So we find all of these PLEs, perfectly logical explanations for why what so-and-so said is not actually what they meant. When in reality, your job in that moment is to just validate, to just accept that what this person of color said happened to them, that it's real, and that they're feeling angry, sad, hurt by it. Even if you know this person personally and you're friends with them, like, your job is not to minimize it in that space. Your job, again, is to validate. So that, to me, is like really important when it comes to acknowledging race and racism. Validate. Your job is not to explain away what happened to that person and find all of the reasons why that person didn't mean what they did. Simply validate. Second, reflect on our own complicity. So I mentioned how I hold a lot of dominant identities. So I'm really cognizant and aware of talking about race and racism. I'm less comfortable talking about sexism, talking about my gender privilege, talking about when it comes to gender nonconforming, transgender issues. So that's less comfortable for me. So I have to recognize that I might be quote unquote woke in a certain area, but then also asleep in lots of other places. And so again, being woke is not sort of an arrival place that one gets to, but that we're all in process, and that because of these dominant identities that we hold, we often don't have to reflect on them, so we're often not as cognizant of the ways in which our privilege and power shows up in our dominance. So we should reflect on the ways that we might be well-intentioned, but might also be engaging in those same behaviors. To go back to the oblivious comment from earlier, how that happens. Resist the urge to become defensive. This, to me, is a really hard thing to do. Like, in spaces when issues of racism come up, white folks, your natural place is to become defensive, is to sort of like push back, to again explain why this didn't happen in the way that you're saying it happened. We have to resist that urge to become defensive and open up our space for listening and hearing. If we make a mistake, we own it, apologize, and try to do differently next time. So there was a time that I was doing a workshop with a group of folks, and I misgendered somebody publicly in the space. I used the wrong gender pronoun for them. I felt horrible at the time, but what I did in that case was I apologized and I moved forward. And so I think, again, I share this to say that we're not experts in everything, and we all make mistakes, but it's what we do when we make the mistake that really matters. And I think that's really important. Again, acknowledge the extra labor. So folks of color in the room, they're often showing up to workplaces exhausted, tired from racial battle fatigue, from having to experience all of the racism. So that takes a toll on us as people of color. So for white folks in the room who are in positions of power, if you're the dean of a campus, the vice president, the director, so think about how that might show up in your space. So how might you acknowledge that extra labor that folks of color on your campus are engaged in, and what might you do as a result of that? So focus on systems too. So one sort of quick story here is I taught a UNV 101 class on Miami's campus 2 semesters ago. So this is a class for entering first-year students. And we were talking about policing and police brutality among Black and brown bodies in the class. And one of the white students in the room became really upset stood up and yelled at the folks in the room and said, my mom is a police officer, and every day she's going out and she's risking her life to protect folks, and you all are talking about police officers as really like bad and problematic people, and I can't stand this anymore. And so it occurred to me in that space that what we had been doing was focusing on individual police officers as good or bad people, as opposed to focusing on the larger systems of policing, of oppression that makes black and brown folks automatically appear to be more threatening than white folks. And so when we focus on systems, we're not talking about individual good versus bad police officers per se. We're talking about the larger system of policing and criminality that places black and brown folks in more precarious positions to be policed and scrutinized differently as compared to white folks, for example. So again, individual oppression matters, but so do systems as well. These systems of oppression are also happening in relationship to the individual people who are engaged in race and racism. So bring readings into your meetings. So maybe you want to talk about racial battle fatigue. So folks in the room may not understand that. So bring in a reading. Maybe that's a way to introduce that topic for a particular day. And then last one is to do your own work. So maybe for folks in the room who are interested can form a learning community to engage around intergroup dialogue, to talk with their colleagues around what this might look like, how we might apply it in our work, bring in some readings, and you meet maybe weekly to just talk about this. So all of us, again, have work to do. And it's important to not treat sort of this as like people are experts and not experts, but that we're all in process and we all have something to gain and learn because, again, we're all participating in these larger systems of oppression that disproportionately